The villa stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its marble columns catching the faint glow of oil lamps flickering in the servants' quarters. But beneath the polished floors and painted frescoes, something far more sinister stirred. In the cellars, iron chains clinked against stone walls. Muffled cries echoed through corridors that never saw sunlight. And in the master's study, ledgers recorded not just grain harvests and wine profits, but human suffering measured in scars, broken bones, and shattered spirits. This wasn't the Rome of senators and philosophers that history often remembers. This was the Rome built on the backs of millions who had no names, no rights, and no hope of escape. A civilization that perfected cruelty as casually as it perfected architecture. Where human beings were reduced to property, and property could be damaged, destroyed, or discarded at will. The morning would bring fresh horrors. Masters who saw torture not as punishment, but as entertainment. Overseers who invented new methods of pain with the same creativity others applied to poetry. And a legal system that didn't just permit this brutality, it encouraged it, codified it, and turned it into the foundation of an empire. Today, we're descending into the darkest chambers of Roman society, where screams were as common as sunrise, and mercy was a luxury no slave could afford. These are the methods, the mindsets, and the machinery of suffering that powered the greatest empire the world had ever known. Before we begin this harrowing journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration into history's most disturbing corners. Now, step carefully. The stones beneath our feet are stained with more than just wine. The Roman slave market wasn't just a place of commerce, it was a theater of dehumanization where torture began long before the first sale. In the Forum Boarium, beneath the shadow of the Palatine Hill, human beings were displayed like livestock, their bodies bearing fresh wounds from the journey that brought them here. Captured warriors from Gaul arrived with brands burned into their foreheads, marking them as property before they'd even learned their fate. Women from Germania bore the scars of shackles that had rubbed their ankles raw during months of forced marching. Children from Britannia, torn from families they'd never see again, huddled together with eyes that had already learned to expect pain. The inspection process itself was torture disguised as business. Potential buyers prodded flesh, examined teeth like horses, and forced slaves to perform degrading acts to prove their worth. Cato the Elder, that paragon of Roman virtue, wrote detailed instructions on how to test a slave's endurance by inflicting calculated pain. A few lashes to see how they bore suffering. A twist of the arm to gauge their breaking point. But this was just the beginning. Once purchased, slaves entered a world where their master's whim was absolute law, and that law was written in blood and agony. The journey from the auction block to their new home often involved more torture: iron collars riveted around their necks, chains connecting them in human trains that stretched for miles, and the constant threat of the whip for any sign of resistance. Roman law was crystal clear: slaves were res, things, not people. They could be beaten, burned, mutilated, or killed without consequence. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code, granted masters absolute power over their human property. And Roman masters, drunk on this unlimited authority, pushed that power to its most sadistic extremes. In the households of the wealthy, torture wasn't an exception, it was routine. The morning ritual might begin with a slave being flogged for serving breakfast a moment too late. The afternoon could bring crucifixion for a servant who dared to look their master in the eye. Evening entertainment might feature a slave forced to fight wild animals in the villa's private arena, their screams providing dinner music for guests who laughed between courses of peacock and wine. The tools of torture were as varied as Roman imagination was cruel. The flagrum, a whip embedded with metal balls and sharp bones, could strip flesh from bone with a single stroke. The fidiculi, thumb screws that crushed fingers joint by joint, extracted confessions that everyone knew were meaningless. Hot irons, designed in shapes that left permanent marks of ownership, branded slaves like cattle while they screamed for mercy that never came. But physical torture was only half the equation. Romans understood that breaking the spirit was often more effective than breaking the body. Slaves were forced to watch their children sold to distant provinces, never to be seen again. Mothers were made to witness their daughters violated by masters who saw rape not as crime, but as privilege. Fathers were compelled to participate in the torture of their own sons, their compliance bought with promises that cooperation might spare their families worse fates. The psychological warfare was systematic and sophisticated. Slaves were given false hope, promises of freedom that were always broken, glimpses of kindness that made the return to cruelty even more devastating. They were turned against each other, forced to inform on fellow slaves for minor infractions, creating a web of mistrust that prevented any organized resistance. In the mines of Spain and the quarries of Egypt, torture took on industrial proportions. Slaves worked in conditions so brutal that death was considered a mercy. Chained together in underground tunnels, they hacked at stone until their hands bled, their backs broke, and their lungs filled with dust that slowly suffocated them. The average life expectancy of a mine slave was measured in months, not years. The overseers, themselves often former slaves who had earned their freedom through exceptional cruelty, invented new torments to increase productivity. Slaves who worked too slowly were suspended by their wrists until their shoulders dislocated. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were revived with cold water and forced to continue until they died at their posts. The strongest were deliberately worked to death as examples to the others. But perhaps nowhere was Roman cruelty more refined than in the great estates that fed the empire. Here, agricultural slavery became a science of suffering, with torture calibrated to extract maximum labor while keeping slaves alive just long enough to be profitable. The villa rustica, the country estate, was a world unto itself where the master's word was divine law and disobedience meant agony beyond imagination. Slaves who failed to meet their daily quotas were stretched on wooden frames until their joints separated. Those caught stealing food, often just scraps to feed starving children, were crucified in the fields they had worked, their bodies left to rot as warnings to others. The ergastulum, the slave prison that existed on every major estate, was a chamber of horrors that would make medieval dungeons seem merciful by comparison. Here, rebellious slaves were kept in conditions so appalling that many begged for death. Chained to walls in darkness, fed just enough to keep them alive, they were brought out only for public torture sessions designed to terrorize their fellow slaves into submission. Columella, the great agricultural writer, described these prisons with the casual tone of a man discussing crop rotation. Underground chambers with tiny windows, he wrote, where the air was thick with human waste and the screams of the tortured. Iron rings set into walls for chaining the most dangerous slaves. Instruments of torture hanging from hooks like farming tools. The creativity of Roman torture knew no bounds. Slaves were buried up to their necks in manure piles, left to suffocate slowly while insects devoured their exposed faces. Others were tied to wild horses and dragged across rocky fields until their bodies were shredded beyond recognition. Some were forced to drink boiling oil or molten lead, their internal organs cooking while they remained conscious. But the Romans didn't just torture bodies, they tortured souls. Slave families were deliberately separated, with children sold to masters hundreds of miles away. Parents were forced to choose which of their children would be spared punishment, knowing that their choice would doom the others. Husbands and wives were made to watch each other's torture, their love used as a weapon against them. The sexual torture of slaves was perhaps the most depraved aspect of Roman cruelty. Both male and female slaves were subjected to systematic rape, not just by their masters but by anyone the master chose to reward. Slave women were forced into prostitution, their earnings going directly to their owners. Young boys were castrated and sold as eunuchs to wealthy Romans who preferred their servants unable to threaten their wives or daughters. The Lupanaria, Rome's brothels, were filled with slaves who had no choice in their degradation. Many were deliberately disfigured, scarred, branded, or mutilated to mark them as property and prevent escape. They were kept in conditions of such squalor that disease was rampant, and death was often the only release from their suffering. In the gladiatorial schools, slave fighters faced a different kind of torture, the slow psychological destruction of being trained to kill for entertainment. These men and women were forced to murder their fellow slaves in front of cheering crowds, knowing that survival meant becoming the very thing their masters wanted them to be, killers without conscience. The training itself was torture. Gladiators were beaten until they learned to fight through pain, starved until they became desperate enough to kill for food, and subjected to mock executions to break their fear of death. Those who showed reluctance were crucified in front of their fellow trainees, their agony serving as motivation for the others. But even successful gladiators faced constant torture. Between fights, they were kept in cells barely large enough to lie down, fed just enough to maintain their strength for the arena. Many were forced to fight wounded, their injuries deliberately left untreated to add drama to their performances. Others were matched against impossible odds, a single man against multiple opponents, or fighters forced to battle wild animals with inadequate weapons. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical. Gladiators were forced to kill friends, lovers, even family members who had been enslaved alongside them. They were given false hope of freedom, the wooden sword that symbolized manumission, only to have it snatched away at the last moment. Many went mad from the constant stress, and madness itself became part of the entertainment. Roman households developed their own specialized forms of torture, tailored to the specific roles slaves played in daily life. Kitchen slaves who burned food were forced to eat it while it was still scalding hot, their mouths and throats blistering as they swallowed. Personal servants who displeased their masters were subjected to elaborate humiliations, forced to crawl on hands and knees, to bark like dogs, or to perform degrading acts in front of other slaves. The torture of household slaves was often more psychological than physical, designed to break their spirit rather than their bodies. A trusted slave might be suddenly accused of theft and tortured until they confessed to crimes they didn't commit. A favored servant might watch their children sold away as punishment for a minor infraction. The uncertainty was itself a form of torture, never knowing when kindness might turn to cruelty, when a moment's inattention might bring hours of agony. Roman masters took particular pleasure in corrupting the relationships between slaves. They forced parents to punish their own children, spouses to betray each other, and friends to compete for their master's favor through acts of increasing degradation. The social bonds that might have provided comfort and resistance were systematically destroyed, leaving each slave isolated in their suffering. The legal system that governed slaves was designed to maximize their vulnerability to torture. Under Roman law, a slave's testimony was only considered valid if it was extracted under torture, the assumption being that slaves would naturally lie unless pain forced them to tell the truth. This meant that any slave called as a witness faced automatic torture, regardless of their willingness to cooperate. The questio, the formal torture session, was conducted with the precision of a religious ritual. Slaves were stripped naked and bound to wooden frames, their bodies stretched until joints began to separate. Hot irons were applied to sensitive areas while questions were repeated over and over. The torture continued until the slave either confessed to whatever crime they were accused of, or died in the process. But the legal torture of slaves went beyond mere testimony. Masters could legally torture their slaves for any reason or no reason at all. A slave who looked sullen might be flogged until they smiled. One who worked too slowly might have their hands crushed to encourage speed. The law didn't just permit this cruelty, it protected masters from any consequences, no matter how extreme their actions. The instruments of legal torture were standardized and refined over centuries of use. The aculeus, a rack that slowly stretched the victim's body until bones broke and muscles tore. The unguli, iron claws that ripped flesh from bone in long, bloody strips. The laminae, heated metal plates that were pressed against the victim's body, cooking flesh while they remained conscious. Roman engineers applied the same ingenuity to torture devices that they brought to aqueducts and roads. They designed machines that could inflict precise amounts of pain, calibrated to extract information without killing the victim too quickly. They created instruments that left specific types of scars, marking slaves with permanent reminders of their punishment. The creativity was boundless and horrifying. Slaves were forced to swallow live coals, their internal organs burning while they screamed. Others were suspended over fires, slowly roasted like meat while their masters dined nearby. Some were buried alive in specially designed chambers, left to suffocate slowly while their cries echoed through the villa. In the provinces, where Roman authority was newer and less secure, the torture of slaves took on additional dimensions of cultural humiliation. Celtic slaves were forced to desecrate their own sacred groves, cutting down trees they considered holy while Roman soldiers laughed. Germanic warriors were made to wear women's clothing and perform degrading dances, their cultural identity stripped away along with their freedom. Egyptian slaves, many of them skilled craftsmen and scholars, were forced to destroy their own work. Scribes made to burn scrolls they had spent years creating, artists compelled to deface their own paintings. The message was clear: not only were their bodies property, but their minds, their skills, and their cultural heritage belonged to Rome as well. The psychological torture of provincial slaves often involved forcing them to participate in the destruction of their own communities. Gallic slaves were made to guide Roman armies to hidden villages, knowing that their cooperation would lead to the enslavement of their own people. British slaves were forced to build the very walls and fortifications that would keep their tribes in subjugation. This cultural torture was perhaps the most insidious form of Roman cruelty. It didn't just break individual slaves, it destroyed entire ways of life, erasing languages, traditions, and beliefs that had existed for centuries. Slaves were forced to adopt Roman names, Roman customs, and Roman gods, their original identities systematically obliterated. The religious torture of slaves was particularly cruel in a society where spiritual beliefs provided the only comfort in an otherwise hopeless existence. Christian slaves were forced to participate in pagan rituals, to sacrifice to gods they considered demons. Jewish slaves were made to eat pork and work on the Sabbath, their dietary laws and holy days turned into instruments of torment. But Romans didn't just torture the living, they tortured the dead as well. Slaves who died were often denied proper burial, their bodies thrown into mass graves or left to rot in the sun. This was considered the ultimate punishment in a culture that believed proper burial was essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. The families of dead slaves were forced to watch their loved ones' bodies being desecrated, knowing that their own fate might be the same. Some masters kept the skulls of executed slaves as decorations, displaying them in their homes as trophies of their absolute power. Others had the bodies of rebellious slaves fed to wild animals, ensuring that nothing remained for burial. The economic torture of slaves was systematic and calculated. Masters deliberately kept their human property on the edge of starvation, providing just enough food to maintain their ability to work but never enough to satisfy their hunger. This constant state of near starvation made slaves desperate and compliant, willing to endure any abuse for the promise of an extra crust of bread. Clothing was another tool of torture. Slaves were given rags that provided no protection from heat or cold, their bodies constantly exposed to the elements. In winter, they shivered in thin tunics while their masters wore warm woolen togas. In summer, they worked under the blazing sun with no protection, their skin burning and blistering while overseers sat in the shade. Medical care was deliberately withheld as a form of torture. Sick slaves were forced to continue working until they collapsed, their illnesses left untreated until they became life-threatening. Injured slaves received minimal care, just enough to keep them alive and working but never enough to fully heal. Many lived in constant pain from old wounds that had been allowed to fester and heal improperly. The torture of slave children was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Roman cruelty. Children as young as 5 were put to work in conditions that would kill adults, their small bodies subjected to the same brutal treatment as their parents. They were beaten for crying, starved for growing too slowly, and sold away from their families without warning. Young slaves were often used as practice targets for their masters' children, who learned cruelty as naturally as they learned Latin. Roman boys were encouraged to beat slave children, to assert their dominance and prepare for their future roles as masters. This created a cycle of violence that ensured each generation would be more cruel than the last. The sexual abuse of slave children was commonplace and legally protected. Young boys and girls were used to satisfy their masters' desires, their innocence destroyed before they understood what was happening to them. Many were deliberately mutilated to increase their value as sexual objects, their bodies modified to suit their owners' preferences. But perhaps the most insidious torture was the destruction of hope itself. Slaves were occasionally shown kindness, a better meal, a day of rest, a moment of human compassion, only to have it snatched away without warning. This psychological manipulation was designed to break their spirit completely, to make them understand that even the smallest comfort existed only at their master's whim. The promise of freedom was the cruelest torture of all. Masters would dangle the possibility of manumission like a carrot before a donkey, always just out of reach. Slaves would work for decades believing that their loyalty and service might eventually be rewarded with freedom, only to die in chains, their hopes unfulfilled. Some masters made elaborate shows of freeing slaves, only to reveal that the manumission was conditional or temporary. Others would free a slave's family members while keeping the slave himself in bondage, using love as a chain stronger than iron. The freed slaves were often worse off than before, struggling to survive in a society that offered them no real place or protection. The torture chambers of Roman villas were marvels of cruel engineering. Hidden beneath beautiful gardens and elegant dining rooms, these underground complexes contained every instrument of pain that human imagination could devise. Walls lined with hooks for hanging victims in various positions. Drains in the floors to carry away blood and other fluids. Soundproofing to muffle screams that might disturb the master's guests. The architecture itself was designed to maximize psychological impact. Narrow corridors that created claustrophobia. Sudden drops into deeper chambers that increased fear. Mirrors placed strategically to force victims to watch their own torture. Every detail was calculated to break the human spirit before the physical torture even began. Roman masters often invited guests to witness torture sessions, turning human suffering into dinner entertainment. These gatherings were social events where the elite could demonstrate their power and sophistication. Guests would sip wine and discuss philosophy while slaves screamed in agony just a few feet away, the contrast highlighting their own superiority and the victim's worthlessness. The casual nature of this cruelty was perhaps its most disturbing aspect. Torture wasn't seen as exceptional or noteworthy, it was simply part of daily life. Roman writers mentioned it in passing, the way modern authors might reference the weather. Cicero complained about the noise his neighbor's torture sessions made during his afternoon nap. Pliny the Younger discussed the best techniques for extracting information from slaves as casually as he might review a new wine. This normalization of torture created a society where empathy was seen as weakness and cruelty as strength. Roman children grew up watching slaves being tortured and learned to see it as natural and necessary. They were taught that slaves weren't really human, that their pain didn't matter, that their suffering was justified by their inferior status. The psychological impact on the torturers themselves was rarely considered. Many Roman masters became addicted to the power that torture gave them, constantly escalating their cruelty in search of new thrills. They lost the ability to feel satisfaction from normal pleasures, requiring ever more extreme acts of violence to feel alive and powerful. Some masters went mad from their own cruelty, their minds twisted by years of inflicting pain. They saw enemies everywhere, trusted no one, and lived in constant fear that their victims might somehow find a way to take revenge. Their villas became prisons where they were as trapped as their slaves, surrounded by the instruments of torture they had created. The economic impact of torture was enormous but rarely calculated. Slaves who were tortured regularly were less productive, more likely to become ill, and died younger than those who were treated with minimal humanity. The constant need to replace dead and disabled slaves was a significant expense, but masters seemed unable to connect their cruelty with their costs. The psychological damage to tortured slaves often made them less valuable as workers. Many became catatonic, unable to perform even simple tasks. Others became violent and unpredictable, dangerous to themselves and others. Some retreated so far into madness that they were essentially useless, requiring constant supervision and care. But Roman masters seemed addicted to torture regardless of its practical costs. They valued the psychological satisfaction of absolute power more than the economic benefits of healthy, productive slaves. The ability to inflict pain without consequence was intoxicating, a drug that many masters couldn't resist even when it damaged their own interests. The religious justification for torture was elaborate and sophisticated. Roman priests taught that slaves were naturally inferior beings, created by the gods to serve their betters. Their suffering was not only acceptable but necessary, a way of maintaining the natural order that the gods had established. To show mercy to slaves was to defy divine will. This religious framework made torture not just permissible but virtuous. Masters who tortured their slaves were fulfilling their sacred duty, maintaining the cosmic balance that kept civilization functioning. The more cruel they were, the more they demonstrated their understanding of divine truth and their commitment to the God's plan. The philosophical justification was equally elaborate. Stoic philosophers taught that slaves were essentially animals in human form, lacking the rational souls that made true humans capable of virtue and wisdom. Their pain was no more significant than the discomfort of a horse being broken or an ox being trained. To feel sympathy for slaves was to misunderstand the fundamental nature of reality. Even philosophers who questioned slavery rarely questioned torture. They might argue about whether it was wise to own slaves or whether freed slaves could achieve virtue, but they accepted that existing slaves could be tortured without moral consequence. The philosophical framework of Roman society made torture seem not just legal but logical. The medical profession contributed to torture by developing techniques to keep victims alive longer and conscious throughout their ordeal. Roman doctors studied anatomy not to heal but to harm more effectively, learning which organs could be damaged without causing immediate death, which nerves could be severed to cause maximum pain. These medical torturers were highly valued by wealthy masters who wanted to extract information or simply prolong their entertainment. They could keep a victim conscious and responsive for days or even weeks, carefully managing their pain and preventing them from escaping into unconsciousness or death. The techniques they developed were passed down through generations of torturers, refined and improved like any other craft. They learned to use drugs to heighten sensitivity to pain, to manipulate the victim's body chemistry to prevent shock, to time their interventions for maximum psychological impact. But not all Romans embraced this culture of cruelty. A small minority of philosophers, writers, and religious leaders spoke out against the torture of slaves, arguing that it corrupted both victim and perpetrator. Seneca wrote that cruelty to slaves hardened the heart and made masters less capable of virtue. Pliny the Elder argued that excessive torture was counterproductive and economically wasteful. Early Christians were particularly vocal in their opposition to torture, teaching that all humans were created in God's image and deserved basic dignity regardless of their social status. This radical idea threatened the very foundation of Roman society and was one of the reasons Christianity was so fiercely persecuted. But these voices of opposition were overwhelmed by the chorus of approval that surrounded Roman torture. The vast majority of Romans not only accepted the torture of slaves but celebrated it as a sign of their civilization's strength and sophistication. They saw their cruelty as proof of their superiority over the barbarian peoples they had conquered. The decline of the Roman Empire can be traced, in part, to the psychological and moral corruption that torture created. A society that normalized extreme cruelty inevitably became cruel in all its dealings, unable to maintain the trust and cooperation necessary for complex civilization. The very brutality that Romans thought made them strong ultimately made them weak. As the empire crumbled, the elaborate systems of torture that had sustained it for centuries began to break down. Slaves escaped in increasing numbers, masters lost the resources to maintain their torture chambers, and the social structures that had made such cruelty possible slowly collapsed. But the legacy of Roman torture lived on, influencing legal systems, social structures, and cultural attitudes for centuries to come. The techniques developed in Roman torture chambers were preserved and refined by later civilizations, passed down like a dark inheritance that continues to haunt human history. The ruins of Roman villas still dot the landscape of Europe and North Africa, their beautiful mosaics and elegant columns hiding the underground chambers where so much suffering took place. Archaeologists occasionally uncover these torture chambers, finding iron rings still embedded in walls, drainage systems still stained with ancient blood, instruments of pain still sharp after 2,000 years. These discoveries remind us that the civilization we admire for its art, architecture, and law was built on a foundation of systematic cruelty that defies imagination. The same hands that created beautiful poetry and profound philosophy also designed instruments of torture that would make modern war criminals recoil in horror. The psychological legacy is perhaps even more disturbing than the physical evidence. The Roman model of absolute power over other human beings, the normalization of cruelty as entertainment, the systematic dehumanization of entire populations. These patterns have been repeated throughout history, from medieval dungeons to modern concentration camps. Understanding Roman torture isn't just an exercise in historical curiosity, it's a warning about what humans are capable of when they convince themselves that some people aren't really people at all. The Romans weren't monsters from another species. They were humans like us, with the same capacity for love and cruelty, creation and destruction, beauty and horror. The slaves who suffered in Roman torture chambers were also human, with dreams and fears, loves and hopes that were systematically destroyed by their masters' cruelty. Their names are mostly lost to history, their stories untold, their suffering unremembered. But their pain was real, their humanity undeniable, their tragedy a permanent stain on the civilization that claimed to represent the pinnacle of human achievement. Today, as we walk through the ruins of the Colosseum or admire Roman sculptures in museums, we should remember the millions who died in agony to build and maintain the empire that created these wonders. Their blood is mixed into the mortar of every Roman building, their screams echo in every Latin inscription, their suffering shadows every celebration of Roman achievement. The question we must ask ourselves is not how the Romans could have been so cruel, but how we can ensure that such systematic dehumanization never happens again. The capacity for torture lies dormant in every human heart, waiting for the right combination of power, justification, and opportunity to awaken. Only by understanding this darkness can we hope to keep it at bay. So tell us, which aspect of Roman slave torture do you find most disturbing? The systematic nature of the cruelty, the legal protection given to torturers, or the way an entire civilization convinced itself that such brutality was not only acceptable but virtuous? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this exploration into one of history's darkest chapters has opened your eyes to the depths of human cruelty, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next journey into the shadows of the past. Remember, the stories we tell on Scandalous Pasts are fictional narratives that may be inspired by real historical events, but are not presented as historical fact. Until next time, remember that the true measure of a civilization isn't found in its monuments or its conquests, but in how it treats the most vulnerable among its people. The Romans failed that test catastrophically, and their empire paid the ultimate price for their cruelty. The stones may be silent now, but the lessons they teach us echo through eternity.